Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Samech Bet. Taneh Rabbi Zakkai, Kameh de Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Zakkai, this is not Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the early Tana, but rather he's an early Amora, a student of Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael. He taught the following Baraita in front of his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan. Zibeach v'kitel v'nisech v'ishtachava b'halem echad, eno chayav ela achat. If someone made a sacrifice to idolatry, and also burned incense to an idol, and poured a libation to an idol, and also bowed down to the idol, but he did it all by mistake, in all one lapse of forgetfulness. It's not that he did one and then remembered, oh, that was prohibited, and then the second, and oh, that was prohibited. It was one lapse of unawareness that he thought all this was permitted for some reason, and then he realized after he did all these four things, even though he did four different actions, he only has to bring one sin offering because it was all within one lapse of unawareness, and therefore, since it's all within one time period, that's you can cover all of them with one korban chatat. That was the braita that Rabbi Zakkai taught. Amar le pok teneh le bara. Rabbi Yochanan, however, says, go and teach that outside. I don't accept that baraita. That I reject that teaching. So it's very interesting that Rabbi Yochanan said, no way, this is not a valid teaching. Rabbi Yochanan thinks that if you do different actions for idolatry, even if in one lapse of unawareness, nevertheless you have to bring korban chatat for each and every sin. He considers them all to be separate sins, whereas Rabbi Zakkai says it's all one category. All right, so let's analyze. Amar Rabbi Abba, ha de Amar Rabbi Zakkai machloket, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Natan, de Tanya, hab'ara lelav yatsa'a dibre Rabbi Yosef, ve Rabbi Natan omer lechalek yatsa'a. So Rabbi Abba is going to try to justify Rabbi Zakkai's baraita, and he's going to explain that what the halacha of Rabbi Zakkai, that we consider all laws, all actions of Avodah Zarah to be one category, not separate different actions, but all actions within one category, and therefore one liable to one sin offering, is actually one side of a machloket regarding the laws of Shabbat. Regarding laws of Shabbat, we have also a discussion about whether all the melachot, 39 melachot of Shabbat, should they be considered to be one category or each one separate. And so this machloket between Rabbi Zakkai and Rabbi Yochanan will parallel the machloket of Tanaim between Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Natan. First, let's explain that machloket on Shabbat, and then we'll show how it's parallel to this machloket. Braita says that hav'ara, making a fire on Shabbat, the Torah explicitly says is an individual melacha. And so why is it being singled out? The Torah says in general, don't do melacha. Okay, what is melacha? Okay, we have a tradition of all the 39 melachot and what they are, and yet the Torah singles out lo tevaru esh b'chol moshevotechem b'yom HaShabbat. Why does the Torah single out making a fire? Two opinions. Rabbi Yosef says is to say that this is only a lav. It's a mere negative prohibition. All the other melachot of Shabbat, if one did them on purpose with witnesses, you would get stoning. But hav'ara, this would be like equivalent of eating non-kosher and would not get the capital punishment. It's only a lav, lashes. That's it. So this teaches that unlike all the other 39, lighting a fire has a different punishment than the rest. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Natan says no. It singles out lighting a fire to show that this is divided from all the other milachot. And we learn from this, just like lighting a fire is singled out, so too every melacha of all the 39 are each separate categories. And this would make a difference in how many sin offerings one would bring. According to the Rabbi Natan, if one committed many different melachot, a person baked and also wrote letters and also built a building and did all these things in one lapse of unawareness, Rabbi Natan would say there you have to bring a korban for each and every act, because we learn from fire that every act, every melacha on Shabbat is its own category. Whereas Rabbi Yosef says no, the pasuk comes to teach us something special just about fire, that's a lav and it doesn't get stoning, but otherwise all the melachot are within one category of don't violate Shabbat. And therefore, if within one lapse of unawareness one does many melachot, one only brings one korban. So that's the machloket. Now we can mash them up. Leman de'amar hav'ara lelav yasa'a, hishtachava'a name lelav yasa'a. According to Rabbi Yosef, that says fire is coming to teach me that this is a lesser punishment. Well then, regarding avodah zarah, also regarding avodah zarah, says generally you can't do avodah zarah. Then there's a pasuk that we saw last time that says don't bow to an idol. So why is that being singled out? Oh, to teach me that bowing to an idol is only a lav, it's only a negative prohibition, doesn't get the death penalty. So those opinions would match up. Leman da'amar hav'ara lechalek yasa, hishtachava name lechalek yasa. According to the opinion that says that hav'ara, fire, is singled out to make it a separate category, that's Rabbi Natan, so too we could learn the same thing regarding idolatry. That why does the pasuk say bowing down is a separate? Why does it single that out? To teach you that every different type of act of idolatry is its own category. And therefore, according to Rabbi Natan, just like on Shabbat, every melacha is a different category, and you'd bring multiple sin offerings, so too, regarding idolatry, it singles it out, and that would be the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who would say that if you do various acts of idolatry, you'd have to bring a sin offering for each and every one, because bowing down is singled out to teach me that each one of them is singled out as a separate category. However, Rabbi Yosef, who says in Hilchot Shabbat that when it says hav'ara, that fire, that's just to lower the prohibition of fire. But otherwise, without that teaching, it seems that Rabbi Yosef would say that all the melachot are one category. And if you did many melachot, within one lapse of unawareness, only one sin offering. Well, that would match Rabbi Zakkai. He would say the same thing. Regarding idolatry, that although it says don't bow down to an idol, that is just to lower its punishment from capital punishment to a mere negative prohibition. But otherwise, all the laws, all the acts of idolatry are all within one category. And so if you do all four of these things within one lapse of unawareness, you only bring one sin offering. And so Rabbi Abba, by making this machloket Amoraim parallel to the machloket Tanaim, is actually reviving and helping Rabbi Zakkai. Rabbi Zakkai can follow Rabbi Yosef. It's true, Rabbi Yochanan has what to rely on. He has Rabbi Natan, but don't kick him out. You wouldn't kick out Rabbi Yosef out of the Bet Midrash. So Rabbi Zakkai's Braita has a good source to rely on of Rabbi Yosef. Okay, so that's Rabbi Abba's thesis. Rabbi Zakkai's Braita can follow Rabbi Yosef, and it's perfectly fine. Okay, the rest of the Gemara on this staff on this Amud is going to bring two challenges against Rabbi Abba. And the first one is by Rav Yosef, Matkif la Rav Yosef. Dilmad kan lo kama Rabbi Yosef hatam haba'ara lelav yase'a, tenafka le chiluk melachot me'achat mehenna. So he says, maybe Rabbi Yosef, regarding Hilchot Shabbat, he says that the law of don't light a fire is singled out in order to teach me that it's not capital punishment of stoning, but it's only a lav, it's just a mere negative prohibition. Then why does Rabbi Yosef say that regarding when it comes to Hilchot Shabbat? Because he already learned that every melacha of Shabbat is its own separate category and would require its own sin offering from a different pasuk in Vayikra that says achat mehenna. Let's look at the pasuk first. This is right here towards the beginning of Sefer Vayikra 4:2. Daber el bnei Selemo nefesh ki techeta bishkaga. This is introduction to the general category of chatat, sin offerings. Mikol misvot Adonai. This pasuk is not particular to Hilchot Shabbat, and we're going to see in a few minutes that we're actually going to attempt to apply it also to idolatry, because it seems like it's talking about everything. Asher lo te'asena ve'asa me'achat mehenna. So if someone sins by mistake. A sin offering is only if someone does something by mistake. Negligent, but still not on purpose. From any mitzvot of that you should not do, any law ta'aseh, and he violates and performs. And this is the curious phrase, me'achat me'hena. Notice the mem and the mem. He does of one, of many. Well, what does that mean? What do you mean? Of, just say, ve'asa achat. Just say he does one. Or you could just say, me'hena. So there's a lot of extra words and letters here. We're going to end up learning 4 things from this. The mem, me, anachat, and me, and henna. So that's what we're going to focus on now. So Rabbi Yosef, he learns that regarding Hilchot Shabbat, that every melacha is a separate category from this phrase, achat me'achat me'henna. Since he learns it from there, when it comes to the law of don't light a fire, well, that we already know there's separate categories. That's why he uses that pasuk to lower the prohibition from capital punishment. That's what he does. That's why he does it regarding Shabbat. But regarding idolatry, where we don't have such a pasuk, maybe even we don't already have a learning about categories. Maybe Rabbi Yosef would readily agree with the other opinions that in Hilchot Shabbat, the pasuk regarding don't bow down is coming to make separate categories. In other words, according to Rav Yosef, all the opinions in this Baraita, in Hilchot Shabbat, Rabbi Yosef only has a disagreement about this pasuk because he already has a way to learn the separate categories. Point is that both Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Natan think that when it comes to Hilchot Shabbat, there are separate categories, and you have to bring multiple sin offerings, and therefore you can't. There's nothing for Rabbi Zakai to rely on, because Rabbi Yosef would readily agree when it comes to the extra pasuk of don't bow down that would come to separate categories of Avodah Zarah, and one would have to bring many sin offerings in that case. Okay, first let's see how we learn me'achat me'henna to complete this question of Rav Yosef. Detanya, Rabbi Yosef Omer, v'asa me'achat me'henna, pamim shechayav achat al kulan, pamim shechayav al kol achat ve'achat. Rabbi Yosef, quoting this pasuk, if someone violates lo ta'aseh, and he does of one of these. Sometimes you are liable to just one sin offering for many actions, and sometimes you're liable for each and every action its own sin offering. V'amar Rabbi Yonatan, my ta'amad Rabbi Yosef. Now this we have to elaborate because this is hard to understand. So Rabbi Yonatan says, what does he mean? Dichtiv ve'asa me'achat mehenna, achat mehenna, henna mehenna, achat shehenna, vehenna she achat. Since the pasuk says from one, from many, so sometimes there could be one from one, meaning even if you just do part of an action, you're liable to one. And sometimes there are many that require many. And sometimes there's one that one action that will require many sin offerings. And sometimes there are many actions that will only require one sin offering. Let's give examples of each of these 4 categories. Achat Shimon, me'achat Shem mi Shimon. So one full action would be if someone writes a name Shimon on Shabbat. If you write a word on Shabbat, then that's it. You're liable, if you do it by mistake, one sin offering for Shimon. Now, what if someone writes Shin Mem and stops? He didn't write the whole word, but the word Shin Mem still spells Shem, which is also a word in Hebrew. So therefore, one is liable to a sin offering, even though he didn't do the full melacha. He had intended to write a whole name, Shimon, and yet he stopped in the middle. Generally, if you only do half of an action, it would not be liable. But in this case, because half of the action is itself an action, because the word Shin Mem does spell something, therefore he has to bring a sin offering. Don't worry about the Mem Sofit or not Mem Sofit. Really, those are just 2 forms of Mem. And we have, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're interchangeable almost. Sometimes you have a Mem Sofit in the middle, and sometimes you have a regular Mem at the end. So really, it's just 2 forms of a letter. We happen to always write the Mem Sofit at the end, but it still spells Shem, even if you don't write a Mem Sofit. So because he wrote a word, even though he intended a longer word, so that's the first category of achat me'achat, one sin offering for only part of an action. Henna avot mehenna toladot. The many is referring to all of the 39 primary categories of Hilchot Shabbat. melachot of Shabbat. Mehena, and something that derives from them, is the toladot, all the actions that are prohibited that are similar to primary categories. Achat shehena zedon Shabbat ushigagot melachot. Where do you have one action that will require many sin offerings? Well, that's if I know it's Shabbat, zedon Shabbat. I know today is Saturday, I know it's Shabbat, but I have a mistake. I think that these various melachot are permitted. I go ahead and I grind flour and I knead it and bake it. I do all these things knowing that it's Shabbat, but I thought that all of these things were permitted. I didn't know that these were prohibited on Shabbat. And so I'm going to have to bring 3 different sin offerings because I did 3 things. Now these are all called one because they're all within melacha of Shabbat, right? They're all part of the general category of melacha and Shabbat. So that's one, but I'm going to require 3 sin offerings because I made mistakes regarding 3 different laws. Hen nashi achat shigagat Shabbat uzdon melachot. And when would I do many actions and yet only bring 1 sin offering? That's if I forgot today was Shabbat. I woke up and I said, oh, it's Tuesday today. I didn't realize it was Shabbat. And then I go ahead and I make myself breakfast and I do many melachot and then I go build a house and I draw 2 letters and so on. In that case, I only bring 1 sin offering for all the melachot. Even if I do all 39 melachot, it's only 1 mistake. I just forgot that today was Shabbat. And so that would be a case of hena shehi achat. So we see that Rabbi Yosef is the one that derives all of this. He derives that Shabbat is in fact separate categories. It's true. If you don't know it's Shabbat, that's just 1 mistake. But if you know it's Shabbat, and you violate many melachot, you have to bring sin offering for many of them, meaning they're all, each one is its own separate prohibition, its own separate category. And Rabbi Yosef learns that from achat mehena. Since Rabbi Yosef learns that already, and then we have the pasuk that singles out don't light a fire. Oh, so that's to teach that lighting a fire is a lesser prohibition because he has another pasuk regarding Shabbat. Well, when it comes to avodah zarah, Rabbi Yosef may very well agree that when it comes to the laws of avodah zarah, the law, the pasuk that says don't bow down, is coming to teach you that there are separate, each one is a separate category of all the actions one does for idolatry. Here, in idolatry, we don't have any other source to teach me that they are separate categories of actions. Then everybody would agree that the verse regarding bowing down is singling that out to teach me that all the actions related to idolatry are separate prohibitions, and one would bring separate sin offerings for each of them. And so that's Rav Yosef's objection to Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba said that Rabbi Zakkai could rely on Rabbi Yosef. Not true. Rabbi Yosef only says that in Shabbat because he already separated the categories. But everyone agrees that they're separate categories on Shabbat. And even Rabbi Yosef would say the extra pasuk of bowing down in idolatry is coming to say separate categories, many sin offerings. Now we ask a follow-up question that will be a further challenge to Rabbi Abba, because we're going to show that actually we can learn that regarding idolatry, they are separate categories from the same pasuk, me'achat mehena. As we said earlier, this pasuk is not talking about in the context of Shabbat, so we should be able to apply it to anything. It says mikol misvot Hashem, and therefore we should be able to learn from here that in idolatry also they are all separate categories. In other words, even if you would say, like Rabbi Abba did, that, Rabbi Zakkai can follow Rabbi Yosef, because Rabbi Yosef says, we're going to learn from the pasuk that's singled out, we'll just learn that it's a lowered prohibition. And so, hishtachavaya, we're just learning that it's a lower prohibition, but he's not bringing a source from there that it's separate categories. Even if you want to say that Rabbi Yosef would interpret that pasuk in that way, still we would learn from here, me'achat mehena, regarding idolatry, that every single act of idolatry is its own category and its own sin offering? That's going to be the question. Now, so that's what we ask. Chiluk melachot avodah zarah name tepukle me'achat mehena achat zebicha me'achat siman echad. Regarding the different actions of avodah zarah, why don't we also learn from this pasuk me'achat mehena, of one of many, that there are separate categories of idolatry, and if you do any one of these melachot, you have to bring another sin offering. Now we have to fill in all the blanks to see what are examples of melachot of avodah zarah that fit into each of these four categories, each of these four words. So achat, we're looking for an action that not only are liable for the whole action, but also me'achat, even part of the action, like shem mishimon, will be an equivalent for idolatry. So achat zebicha. If you do a slaughter shechita on an animal for avodah zarah and do a full shechita, certainly that's an act of idolatry and one is liable capital punishment. Me'achat, part of it is if one cuts just one of the pipes, just the windpipe, then it's only half of a shechita, but that itself would be liable to capital punishment, even if you don't do a full shechita of both of the pipes. Henna avot zibuach kitur nisuch hishtachavaya mehenna toladot shabar makel lefaneha. Now we have henna and mehenna, and from that in Shabbat we learned avot and toladot. So henna would also be avot for idolatry, which is sacrificing, incense, libation, and bowing down. Mehenna, we would learn there are other things that are not allowed that we derive from the first one, toladot. For example, if one breaks a stick in front of an idol, this would kind of be like a symbolic slaughtering, where when you slaughter an animal, you break its neck, so you do it symbolically with a stick. This would be a tolada of zibuach. So we can have many different melachot that are derived from the original categories of melacha of avodah zarah. Achachi henna, and where we have a case where you do one general acts that are in one general category, and you'd bring many sin offerings. We saw regarding Shabbat that would be if I knew it was Shabbat and I do many melachot, they're all generally melachot Shabbat, but I have to bring many sin offerings. So that would be equivalent in idolatry. Zedon avodah zarah. I know that avodah zarah is not allowed. Shigigat avodot, but I don't know that doing this particular thing, I didn't know that incense and libations were not allowed to do to idolatry, and so I would have to bring many different sin offerings. Right? See here that there's we can learn from here that it's many different categories and many sin offerings. And henna shiachat shigat avodah zarah uzdon avodot. And when would you have a case where you do many actions but only one sin offering? In Ilchot Shabbat, it's when you don't know it's Saturday. So I did many offerings, but it's only one mistake. So the equivalent here would be that I don't realize that this is idolatry. I know that making a sacrifice and incense, I know that all those things would be prohibited to an idol, but I don't even realize that this is idolatry, and therefore I would only bring one sin offering. Okay, so if we follow this, then for sure the Zakai is wrong, and there's no way he could rely not on the Yoseh, not on anybody else, right? It's clear if you accepted this darasha, that of me'achat mehenna, and apply it to idolatry, that all the actions of idolatry are separate categories, multiple sin offerings, a total rejection of Rabbi Zakai's baraita. So we ask further on this last case. What does that mean that you didn't know this was idolatry? You forgot the whole category of idolatry. If he thinks that the thing he's bowing down to is a Bet Knesset, it turns out that's actually a pagan temple. But he didn't know that. He thought it was a Bet Knesset, and he bows down to it. So his heart was directed to heaven, so he's not deserving of any sin offerings at all. So that can't be the case. Or maybe he saw a statue and he bowed down to the statue. And he thought it was just a person, but really it was an idolatrous statue. Well, let's see. If he accepted upon it himself as a god, then that's purposeful idolatry, and yes, he would get capital punishment for it, and not a sin offering. If he didn't accept this as a god for himself, then he didn't do anything. He just bowed to a statue of nothing, of a person. He didn't consider it a god. Then he doesn't have to bring a sin offering either. So we're still looking for a case where he has some awareness that this thing is an idol, right? He has to know something about that. If he doesn't know it's an idol at all, then he wouldn't have to bring a sin offering. He has to know that there's something wrong in what he's doing, but he has to be a case where he thinks that it's permitted. So we have an answer. He knows this is an idol, and he knows that if he would do it on purpose and consider it a god, they would be prohibited. But he is serving it not because he really thinks it's a god, but he's serving it because of love of a person or fear of a person. As someone who's like, his boss told him, hey, you better do this. Or out of love, he wants to show his obedience to someone for some reason, and he's serving it for that reason. And he thinks that, since it's Ma'ava Mir'ah, he thinks it's allowed, even though he knows that this is a pagan temple, or he knows that this is a statue of a god. But he said, I don't believe in it, but I think it's allowed if I'm doing it ma'ava u'mirah. And in fact, it's not allowed. And so if he does all different actions of slaughtering and incense to this idol, but he's only doing it out of fear and he thinks it's allowed, but turns out he's wrong, really it's not allowed, but that's all one lapse of awareness of not knowing that this whole thing is not allowed. And that would be a case of where he brings only one sin offering for multiple actions. So in fact, we could have such a case, and this derasha would apply, and if this derasha does apply, then certainly Rabbi Zakkai would be rejected. So we say, okay, this can all be reconciled according to Abaye, meaning the challenge against Rabbi Abba is correct according to Abaye, because he says that someone who worships Ma'ava Mir'ah, we saw previously, is in fact liable. So if he makes a mistake and thinks it's permitted when in fact liable, but he did it by mistake, but he knows that there is such a prohibition in general of idolatry. So that would be a case where he does many actions and is liable to one. So the derasha is possible. But Rava says, Ava and Yir'ah, one is not liable to at all. If you serve idolatry just out of fear of a person, then you're not liable to capital punishment, and therefore you wouldn't be liable to bring a sin offering either for that mistake. So then how would Rava be able to apply this derasha of me'achat mehena to idolatry? In order to apply the derasha, you have to fill in all four categories, and we don't have a case that fulfills this last category. Ela be'omer mutar. We have an answer according to Rava. When a person thinks that idolatry and idol worship in general is permitted. He says, he doesn't know of the whole category of the prohibition of idolatry. So in one lapse of unawareness, he forgets that there's such a law, although he knows that sacrificing and incense are ways in which one does worship. These are ways in which one worships Hashem. So he knows that these are worshiping activities, but he thinks idolatry is permitted, and then he realizes, idolatry is not permitted. So that would be the case according to Rava. Tifshot de be'amine Rava merav Nachman ha'elem ze vazeh beyado mahu. Wait a second. If you accept this answer, then we would be able to resolve a question that Rava asked Rav Nachman about Hilchot Shabbat. Rava was asked Rav Nachman about Hilchot Shabbat, and we had no resolution to this. What if on Shabbat someone doesn't realize it's Shabbat, he thinks it's Tuesday, but in addition to that, he doesn't know that cooking and kneading and baking and grinding on Shabbat are not allowed. He missed that day in school, and he doesn't know that these melachot are allowed, even if it were Shabbat. So he's making a double error. And he does these three different melachot, and it is actually Shabbat, although he thinks it's Tuesday. What would happen then? Does he bring only one sin offering because he thought it was Tuesday, not Shabbat? Or does he bring multiple sin offerings because he made multiple mistakes. He didn't know about any of these melachot. So which one do we take? Since he made both types of errors, which one do we focus on? And so would he have to bring one or many? And Rav Nachman had no answer. If, in fact, we would accept this one, well, then this would kind of be the same thing as this case, because here, if he doesn't know that there's such a thing as idolatry at all, well, then he wouldn't know, certainly, that there's no prohibition of idolatry at all. Then he certainly wouldn't know that there is such a thing as sacrificing to idolatry and a separate prohibition of incense to idolatry. But if you don't know the whole category, then you wouldn't know any of these things. It's not the same as in Hilchot Shabbat, where you can have one without the other, because it could be Tuesday, and so I forgot that it was Tuesday. That's the general category. Or I can know it's Shabbat and not know these separate melachot. So you could have one without the other, or in Shabbat you could have both. That was his question. Regarding idolatry, if you don't know there's such a thing as idolatry, well, then you wouldn't know any of the specific prohibitions of idolatry either. And so if we follow Ravan, accept this answer, that someone who says, I thought there was no idolatry, and he brings only one sin offering, well then, for this question that Rava asked Rav Nachman, we can answer that would only be one sin offering. But Rav Nachman never answered that. So how come he didn't make that connection? Does that mean that this answer is wrong? And the answer is no. Tifshot no chayav elachat halakashya vetifshot. So how come we didn't answer Rava's question that one would be liable only to one if you forgot both that it's a Shabbat and you didn't know the melachot? So how come we didn't resolve it in this way? And the answer is, oh, you're right. This is a good resolution. So we should resolve it in this way. Now, just because at that point when they discussed it, Rava and Rav Nachman didn't think of this resolution, doesn't mean it's wrong. So we can use this resolution in fact. And so now we see, both according to Abaye and Rava, there is a way to fill in this Rasha for all the four categories of meh, achat, and meh, hena, and apply it to idolatry. And if once we do that, then no matter what Rabbi Yosef said about just lowering the level, and even if we use the hishtachavaya just to lower the level of capital punishment, still we could learn from this derasha of me'achat mehena that avodah zarah has separate categories, multiple sin offerings, and that itself would be a rejection of Rabbi Zakai's baraita. And then we ask, hold on, I know we've been trying very hard to apply me'achat mehena to avodah zarah, but can you do that? Dilo hachaketi b'mashiach par u'benasi sa'ir u'beyachid kispa u'se'ira. Here in chapter 4 in Sefer Vayikra, when it's talking about the different korban hatats, it singles out different people. If it's Mashiach, a Kohen Gadol, who makes an individual mistake, he brings a par, whereas a nasi, a king who makes a mistake, brings a sa'ir. A regular person brings a kispa or a se'ira. So you see that regarding other sins, that would be a gradation of what type of animal they bring. And that would be true for Hilchot Shabbat and other things. Ve'ilu ba'avodah zarah tenan v'shavin shebese'ira ki yachid. But avodah zarah, that's not true. If a Kohen Gadol violates avodah zarah by mistake, then the Mishnah teaches that even the Kohen Gadol brings a se'ira, just like an individual person. He brings a goat, and he does not bring a bull. And so but this chapter in Vayikra says that he brings a bull. Therefore, this entire chapter in Vayikra cannot apply to avodah zarah. So this phrase me'achat mehena, which is in this chapter, we cannot apply it to avodah zarah, and therefore this particular challenge against Rabbi Abba in the end is rejected. V'tziu lamidi, and there's nothing more to say. This is the end of this part of the discussion. So in the end, we cannot apply, in fact, me'achat mehena to avodah zarah, and that's good for Rabbi Abba, because then Rabbi Abba, because if you accept this derasha, then for sure avodah zarah is going to be separated into multiple categories and have many sin offerings, and that then you'd reject Rabbi Abba and you'd reject Rabbi Zakai. Without this, we still have the first question that we had before, Rav Yosef's challenge against Rabbi Abba, and so that objection still stands, even though this second objection we were able to reject. Now, everything that we just learned before was only one version of the baraita that Rabbi Zakai taught. But now we're going to discuss a different version altogether. Ki ata Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda amar. When Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, Hachi tena kameh. Rabbi Zakkai taught the following beraita before Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan said, I reject that, get out of here. But it wasn't the beraita that we saw above. The event happened in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Zakkai and Rabbi Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael. In Bavel, they heard one version of it, and now they heard a second version of that story and what that beraita was. Here it is. Chomer b'Shabbat b'shar misvot. Chomer b'shar misvot mi b'Shabbat. There is one way in which Shabbat is more stringent than other commandments, and there's another way in which other commandments are more stringent than Shabbat. What are the ways? Chomer b'Shabbat Shabbat asa shetayim be'alem echad chayav al kol achat ve'achat. Mashen ken b'shar misvot. Regarding Shabbat, if one did 2 or more violations of Shabbat within one lapse of unawareness, then one is liable for each and every one. Whereas in other mitzvot, that's not the case. Whereas there is a stringency, shagag b'lo mitkaven chayav, mashen ken be'Shabbat. In other mitzvot, if you made a mistake, less than a mistake, you didn't even have intention to do an action at all. You were just involved in something else, preoccupied with something else. You thought you were doing a different action, and then you did something that ended up being an action that is in fact prohibited. Then in other mitzvot, one is liable. But in Shabbat, you need melechet machshevet. You have to know that you are doing an action and intending to do that action. And so this is a way, and otherwise you would be patur on Shabbat. That's a way in which other mitzvot are more stringent than Shabbat. So now we're going to explain what the cases are here. Amar mor, chomer b'Shabbat Shabbat asa shetayim v'chule hechi dameh. In the beginning, when you say Shabbat is more stringent, in that Shabbat, if you do 2 actions within one lapse of unawareness, you will have to bring many sin offerings. What would be the case? Well, if the case of Shabbat is where you did 2 different things of reaping and grinding, and you would be liable. You didn't know that reaping was not allowed, and you didn't know grinding was not allowed. So you'd still have to bring 2 different sin offerings because these are separate categories of avot melachot. Well, what would be the equivalent in other mitzvot if you ate forbidden fat and blood? Well, then also, these are both involve eating forbidden things, but they are separate categories, separate prohibitions regarding eating, and you would also have to bring 2 sin offerings. So there's no greater stringency in Shabbat than in kashrut laws in such a case. So that can't be the case of Shabbat that we're talking about. Okay, so let's look for a case. We'll start from the other direction. What's a case in which one would only bring 1 sin offering in other mitzvot? Well, if I ate some forbidden fat now, and then I waited a while, and I ate another amount of shiur of forbidden fat, and within the same lapse of unawareness, I forgot that forbidden fat is not allowed. I ate some now, I eat some tomorrow, and then I realized after that I still only bring 1 sin offering because it was within the same lapse of unawareness. Well, let's look at a parallel case in Shabbat. What if I did some reaping in the morning and then I did some reaping in the afternoon on Shabbat, and I didn't realize in between that it was prohibited, and so this is all 1 lapse of awareness? You would also bring only 1 sin offering. And so we see actually we cannot find a case that there would be an equivalent case of Shabbat and other mitzvot in which Shabbat would be more stringent, you bring 2 offerings, and another case like kashrut, we'd only bring 1 offering. And so this is not true. We cannot find a case, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan said, take this braita and go teach it outside, because it's not true. We cannot find a case that fulfills this statement. And that's why he kicked it out. Now we ask, what would be Rabbi Yochanan's problem? We can find a case. If the on avodah zarah. Maybe, in fact, we are talking about on Shabbat, we do two different melachot, like reaping and grinding. And that's not true of other mitzvot. Now you're right that regarding forbidden foods, it's the same thing. But let's assume that when it says shar mitzvot, it's not all other mitzvot, but specifically idolatry. That's where it's less stringent. Ked Rabbi Ameh, Tamar Rabbi Ameh, zibeach v'kiter v'nisech. Rabbi Ameh taught that if one made a sacrifice to idolatry and also incense and also poured libation, all in one period of unawareness, he only brings one sin offering. This statement of Rabbi Ameh is the previous version of the Braita that we learned from Rabbi Zakkai. So you see that these two traditions are related. The one on Amud Aleph went straight to this statement and said, oh, Rabbi Zakkai said this statement. In this version, Rabbi Zakkai said something altogether different. He just said, Shabbat is more stringent than some other law. Well, what other law? We couldn't find a case, but then we said, oh, we have a case, avodah zarah. So if the other law, in fact, is avodah zarah, then Rabbi Zakkai's baraita would make sense if you assume, like Rabbi Ameh, that regarding Shabbat, if you do two different categories, two different avot, you bring two sin offerings. Whereas in idolatry, even though you're doing various acts, they're all considered one category of avodah zarah if it's within the same lapse. And so now we're wondering about Rabbi Yochanan. Why did you reject Rabbi Zakkai? He could be talking about this case with the assumption of the law of Rabbi Ameh. And we answer, no, we can't say that the Resha is talking about avodah zarah when it says other mitzvot, because we have to find also a case in the sefa of that baraita and say that also is applying to avodah zarah. The sefa, remember, was chomer b'shar mitzvot sheb'shar mitzvot shagag v'lo mitkaven hayav. Other mitzvot are more stringent because regarding other mitzvot, if you did something without kavanah, you were acting totally without intent to perform any act at all, one is liable in other mitzvot, and that's not true on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you need to have melechet machshevet and know that you're intending to do that particular act. So, let's see. Shogeg v'lo mitkaven ba'avodah zarah. Hechi dameh, what would be a case of acting without a knowledge at all, just doing something else entirely, regarding avodah zarah? If he thought that this was a bet knesset, and in fact it was a pagan temple, and he bowed down to it, well, his heart was to heaven, and therefore he would not bring a sin offering at all. So that's not a way in which avodah zarah is more stringent. And if he saw a statue and he bowed to it, so it depends. If he accepted it as a god, he knows what he's doing. He thought he said, "This is you are my god," and bowed to it. Then he gets capital punishment. And if he didn't accept it, then he's not doing anything. So what? So you bow to a statue of Abraham Lincoln? That's nothing. If you don't consider it a god, then you don't have to bring a sin offering. So what's a case where avodah zarah would be liable in that and more stringent than Shabbat? Oh, we have an answer. If he worships this thing, he doesn't really think it's a god, but he wants to impress someone or he's afraid of someone, and he bows down to this thing thinking that it's permitted. And in fact, it's not permitted. And if we assume like Abaye that says someone who worships avodah zarah, not because he believes in it, but because out of love and fear, it is in fact liable. He is just acting. He's not doing avodah zarah in his mind. He's just, because he doesn't believe in it, he's just bowing to impress someone. So that would be a case of mitasek, and yet regarding avodah zarah, he would be liable. Whereas in Shabbat, if you're doing something like that, you're not liable. Good. So we can explain this for Abaye. But according to Rava, he says that if one bows to Avodah Zarah, knowing that it's not a god, but out of fear or love, then that patur, you don't have to bring a korban even. And so that therefore this is not a case where Avodah Zarah would be more stringent than Shabbat. So how could we have a case for Rava? Ela be'omer mutar, ma'ashen ken beShabbat patur legamre. Oh, we do have a case. If someone thinks that idolatry is totally permitted, he never heard of such a prohibition of idolatry, and he goes and does it. So he's just bowing down. He's doing nothing. He's not intending to do any significant act at all. And so because he thinks it's permitted, and yet the law is that in fact it's not permitted, and you would have to bring a sin offering for doing that. That's more stringent than Shabbat, where Shabbat one would be completely not liable. Ma'ashenken b'Shabbat patur legamre. It's not true for Shabbat. If you don't even realize you're doing something on Shabbat, then you don't even bring a sin offering. So there we go. We actually can figure out that a case for both the Resha and the Sefa, that when it says She'ar mitzvot, it's talking about Avodah Zarah in particular, and there is a way in which Shabbat is more stringent than Avodah Zarah, and a way in which Avodah Zarah is more stringent than Shabbat, and thereby we can uphold this baraita of Rabbi Zakkai. And now we're wondering, why did Rabbi Yochanan reject it when we can say that Shar Mitzvot is referring to Avodah Zarah? And so now we explain the problem of Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, he has a real problem with it, because Ad kan la be'amine Rav Rav Nachman ha'alem ze v'ze ela lechiyu be'chadai lechiyu be'tarte patur legamre lekaleman de'amar. Remember that question that Rava asked Rav Nachman, where one thinks it's Tuesday, and he also doesn't know it's Shabbat, and he also doesn't know that cooking and kneading and grinding and building are prohibited on Shabbat, and he does all those things on Shabbat, thinking that it's Tuesday, and not even knowing that those are prohibited. The question that Rava was asking was, are you liable to one because he thought it was the wrong day, or to many because he didn't know about each of these prohibitions, so he made multiple mistakes? But no one thought that he doesn't have to bring anything at all. Certainly he has to bring at least one, and in that case there would be no way in which Avodah Zarah is more stringent than Shabbat, because even on Shabbat you'd have to bring one. So now we understand Rabbi Yochanan's challenge and why he kicked out this baraita. And then we say, my kushya, wait a second, we can explain this baraita just fine. Dilma le'olam malach reshav avodah zarah v'sefa b'shar mitzvot. Why not say that the first half of the baraita is in fact talking about avodah zarah, and regarding avodah zarah we'll keep Rabbi Ameh, that when it comes to Shabbat everything is separate categories, and if you do many melachot then you have to bring many sin offerings. Regarding avodah zarah we consider all acts of avodah zarah to be all within the same category, and you'd only bring one sin offering. And that's the way in which Shabbat is more stringent than other mitzvot, particularly avodah zarah. And the sefa that says if you do something belo mitkaven, and there other mitzvot are more stringent than Shabbat. And although it's true, we can't find a case of Avodah Zarah that would be precisely equivalent for Shabbat, in which Avodah Zarah would be stringent and Shabbat less stringent, because Avodah Zarah, if you don't know about the whole law of Avodah Zarah, then you still bring one korban. And regarding Shabbat, even if you don't know the whole law at all of Shabbat and don't know anything about any of the melachot either, you still bring at least one. So we can't find a case of Avodah Zarah that would be equivalent to a case of Shabbat, in which Avodah Zarah would be more stringent than Shabbat. But we can find such a case in other mitzvot. So, Veshagag belo mitkaven tekasabar roku ubol'o. And we can have a case where other mitzvot are more stringent than Shabbat. Regarding case of kashrut, if you have forbidden fat. So here's a simple case of forbidden fat. Let's say I have a cup of liquid in front of me, and I think it's permitted fat, and I drink it, and it turns out it's forbidden fat, so I made a mistake, I have to bring a sin offering. But what about the following case? I have a cup of saliva in front of me. I know it's gross to drink saliva, but we'll go with this for a minute. And he drinks it. Drinking saliva is not called an act of drinking. It's not considered eating. It's not food. It's not a drink. It's just, something that was already in your body. So that's not even considered an act at all of drinking. Nevertheless, when it comes to the laws of kashrut, if you think it's saliva, but it turns out to be forbidden fat, you still have to bring a sin offering, as we're going to explain in a minute, because you got some enjoyment out of it. I mean, you were thirsty. I don't know, whatever. It still stops the drying of your mouth by drinking it. So because one got some pleasure out of it, you still have to bring a sin offering, even though he didn't even intend to do an act of drinking at all, because it's not called drinking if it's not a food that you're drinking. Ma she'en ken b'Shabbat patur, shenitkaven lagbiya et hatalush v'chatach et hamechubar patur. On Shabbat, however, if you are intending to do something that's totally permitted, for example, you see a carrot on the floor, and you think it's not connected to the ground, so you pick it up because you want to eat the carrot. That's like a totally permitted act. Turns out it was actually connected to the ground, and when you picked it up, by mistake, you pulled it off. This is not the kind of mistake before, that if you don't know it's Shabbat, or you don't know that detaching something from the ground is a melacha. In those cases, you bring a sin offering. But if you don't, I didn't even think I was doing anything at all. It's just like I'm walking on the street, and I see a piece of dirt on the floor, I step on the dirt. I'm just walking regular. Turns out it was an ant. I killed an ant. Okay, it's not that I know that ants killing an ant is not allowed. I know it's Shabbat, but I was just walking. I wasn't even doing anything. I wasn't even intending to kill an ant, in which, if I did that by mistake, I would bring a sin offering. Here, I'm just walking. I'm just picking up the carrot. So on Shabbat, where we need melechet machshevet, if I do something that is not an intention even to do an act at all, that could be prohibited, then I am not liable to a sin offering. And this is the case, in fact, where we can fulfill the second part of the baraita regarding other mitzvot, in a case like this, of forbidden fat, where it's in fact forbidden fat, although I think it's something else. And so we can explain this baraita perfectly fine, according to, if we assume it to be ameh in the first half, and this baraita that Rabbi Zakkai said was totally fine. Now, in order to accept this, we have to accept the following explanation. וכתרב נחמן אמר שמעון דאמר המתעסק בחלבים בעריות חייב, שכן נהנה המתעסק בשבת פטור מלאכת מחשבת אסרה תורה. Rav Nachman said, in the name of Shemuel, that someone who is doing an unaware act, he thinks he's doing something totally different. If it comes to forbidden fat and forbidden sexual relations, one is liable because he gets benefit from it, he gets pleasure from it. So even though he thinks it's his wife in the bed, so he's doing something that's totally permitted. It's not that he forgot and turns out it was his sister, someone that he's prohibited to. It's not that he knew who it was, but he thought it was allowed. No, he's doing something that he thinks is totally allowed. He doesn't even know that it's, he knows the law, but he doesn't even know that he's doing an act that could be prohibited. So when it comes to forbidden fat and incest, one is liable because one gets pleasure out of it. However, if one is doing something on Shabbat where he's just acting in a normal way, not even intending to do the melacha that he ends up violating, then that is permitted and he doesn't have to bring a korban at all, because the Torah only said that intentional action is prohibited, whereas if he's just mitasek, it's permitted. And so now we have an explanation of this baraita. We have to, it's true, say that the Resha is talking about avodah zarah, and the Sefa is talking about other mitzvot, like eating non-kosher or arayot, but then this baraita is perfectly fine, and so Rabbi Zakkai taught this baraita. It's a baraita that we can, in fact, explain, and it would actually assume Rabbi Ameh's interpretation that all the acts of avodah zarah are within one category. So why did Rabbi Yochanan reject it? Here's why. Rabbi Yochanan leta'ameh dela mokim matnita resha bechad ta'ama ve'sefa bechad ta'ama, because Rabbi Yochanan, in general, even in other cases, does not accept to explain a braita where the first half is following one opinion and the second half is following a different opinion, or the first half is assuming a certain case and the second half is assuming a different case. Like here, we have to assume that Shar Mitzvot in the Resha is talking about Avodah Zarah, Shar Mitzvot in the Sefer is talking about Chelev and Arayot. Rabbi Yochanan says if you're going to explain two parts of a braita, they have to be consistent, and therefore he rejects it. And we see that Rabbi Yochanan has this rule in another place in Mishnah and Avodah Zarah. Tamar Rabbi Yochanan mande metargem li chavit aliba dechad tana movil na mane batre lebe masuta. In a Mishnah in Baba Metziah that has to do with laws of a barrel, we can explain the two parts of the Mishnah if we say the Resha is according to one Tana and the Sefer is according to a different Tana. But Rabbi Yochanan didn't like that explanation. He says if anyone can reconcile the two halves of that Mishnah according to one Tana, I'll serve him. I'll carry his clothes to the bathhouse for him. I'll consider him my master, my teacher. So you see, Rabbi Yochanan did not accept the other answer. Other people did accept that there was two different authors of the Resha and Sefer, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan, when he heard this baraita, which can only be explained by saying the Resha is Avodah Zarah and the Sefer is Chalavim v'Arayot, he said, get this baraita out of here, because he didn't like that methodology of explaining a baraita. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.